The snap of bone was the only birthday song she'd hear. Blood, hot and coppery, steamed in the crisp morning air, painting the fallen leaves a shade of violent crimson. 18 winters had sharpened her senses, honed her instincts, and carved the hope from her heart. The stag's life fled in a final, shuddering sigh, and a familiar emptiness settled over Lyra. She was a survivor, a ghost in the whispering woods, and today she was 38 years old. Deep down, she knew the truth. The kill was a victory, but the day was a defeat. Another year marked by solitude, another year mateless. Her inner wolf, a restless creature of instinct and longing, whined softly in the back of her mind. It, too, felt the hollow ache of a bond never formed, a pack never joined. She ran a hand over her worn leather tunic, her fingers tracing a faded scar near her hip, a reminder of a past she couldn't outrun. Because of that one day, that one act of defiance against a corrupt alpha, her life had become this endless, silent hunt. Was it truly just for speaking out? Or was there something more they feared? The question was a ghost that haunted her quietest moments. With every heartbeat, the silence of the forest seemed to grow louder, amplifying her loneliness. She began the work of dressing the stag, her movements efficient, practiced. Not only that, but her mind drifted to the stories her mother used to tell, tales of fated mates finding each other across impossible distances, their souls calling out like twin stars. What a cruel joke. Her star had burned out long ago. Maybe it was fate that she was meant to be alone, a wild thing belonging only to the trees and the moon. Still, she couldn't stop the memory from surfacing, the shame of her exile, the accusing eyes of her pack, the false pity in her alpha's voice as he cast her out. Unfit, he had called her. A danger to our stability. The words had been a brand on her soul, and with every passing year, she believed them more. That's why she pushed the hope away, because hope was a vulnerability she simply could not afford. The wind shifted and her head snapped up. Her breath caught. It was a scent she knew, a scent she dreaded. Steel, sweat, and the faint, arrogant musk of the King's patrol. They were close, too close. For months, their patrols had been pushing deeper into the woods, their patterns more aggressive, more unpredictable. Why now? What are they searching for? Without thinking, her body moved on instinct. She had to move the kill, find a more secure place, and disappear back into the shadows she called home. She gripped the stag's leg, her muscles straining as she began to drag it towards the dense undergrowth of the western ravine. She avoided the eastern ridge because the patrols were always more frequent there, their boots trampling the game trails. But then, a twig snapped behind her. Not an animal. It was the sharp, deliberate sound of a boot heel. Her heart skipped. A beat later, a voice cut through the air, cold and authoritative. "Hold, exile." She froze, her blood turning to ice. They had found her. In that moment, her world tilted. 18 years of survival, of being a ghost, had ended with a single careless step. Before she could move, before she could even think to run, they were on her, their silver armor flashing between the trees. The chase was over before it began.
He felt it. A faint, inexplicable restlessness that had nothing to do with the tedious drone of his counsel. It was a hum beneath his skin, an echo in his soul, a string being pulled taut somewhere far beyond the stone walls of the obsidian citadel. He sat on his throne, a king of wolves, and felt utterly, completely alone. He watched Lord Valerius, a silver-furred sycophant whose ambitions stank worse than a rotting carcass, prattle on about trade disputes with the southern packs. But then the real agenda emerged. "And my daughter Cressa has come of age, my king," Valerius said, his voice slick with false deference. "A fine Luna she would make, strong, youthful, able to secure the royal line for generations." Rorik's jaw tightened. He was a king without a queen, a wolf without a pack heart, a man without his soul's other half. The council saw his matelessness as a political weakness, a vacuum to be filled by one of their own daughters. They offered him pawns, broodmares meant to secure their own power. In fact, he despised these meetings more than anything, because they were a constant, grating reminder of his profound failure to find the one person he was created for. He raised a hand, and the chamber fell silent. "Your daughter's eligibility has been noted, Lord Valerius," Rorik said, his voice a low rumble that promised nothing. "As have the daughters of 3 other council members. Is there any matter of actual importance to discuss, or are we finished with this mating auction?" The barb hit its mark. Valerius flushed, his lips thinning. The other lords shifted uncomfortably. More importantly, Rorik knew he couldn't keep them at bay forever. A king needed a queen. A pack needed a Luna. His father had warned him of the council's hunger for influence, an ambition that had grown unchecked in the years before Rorik took the throne. Because of that legacy of council overreach, his own rule was a constant battle of wills. As the meeting finally dissolved, the strange restlessness returned, stronger this time. It was a pull, an insistent tugging at his soul. What was it? He dismissed his guards, seeking the cold solitude of his solar. The silence in his chambers was a crushing weight. He had everything a man could want: power, a kingdom, respect, and yet he had nothing at all. He stared out the black glass window, over the city, and towards the dark line of the whispering woods. Without warning, the captain of his royal guard entered, his expression grim. "My king, we have captured a trespasser on the border, an exile from the old Northern Ridge pack." Ordinarily, Rorik would have dismissed it. An exile was a matter for the magistrates. But then, the pull in his soul intensified into a violent, undeniable command. "See her." As if pulled by a string, he turned from the window. The words left his mouth before he could question the instinct behind them. "Bring her to the throne room." The captain blinked, surprised. "Sire?" "Now," Rorik growled, his voice leaving no room for argument. He didn't know why. He didn't know what compelled him. Deep down, he knew the truth. Something was about to change forever.
Panic was a wild animal clawing its way up her throat. They bound her wrists with rough rope that bit into her skin, the familiar chafe a cruel mockery of her lost freedom. She was being marched back toward the one place she had spent nearly 2 decades praying she would never see again, the obsidian citadel, a gilded cage, a place of nightmares. As they dragged her from the tree line, the citadel loomed in the distance, a shard of polished black stone stabbing at the sky. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. "Move it, exile!" one of the guards snarled, shoving her forward. She stumbled but caught herself, her chin held high. They would not see her fear. They would not hear her plead. They would not break her spirit. She was Lyra of the Whispering Woods, not the disgraced girl they had cast out. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the tremor in her hands. The memories were flooding back. The cold stares, the whispered insults, the finality of the gate closing behind her. As they entered the city, the scents were overwhelming. Cook smoke, unwashed bodies, perfumes, and underneath it all, the oppressive scent of thousands of wolves packed together. It was suffocating. Her wolf, accustomed to the clean, wild air of the forest, paced nervously within her. She was a creature of the wild, and this place was a stone trap. Her immediate goal was simple: endure. But her emotional state was a chaotic storm of fear, defiance, and a bone-deep sense of despair. The throne room doors were massive, carved with scenes of glorious battles and powerful alphas of old. They swung open with a groan, and she was thrust inside, stumbling onto the polished floor. The room was a cavern of hostile faces, of silks and jewels and judging eyes. And at the far end, on a throne of obsidian and silver, sat the king, King Rorik. She had only seen him from a distance years ago. Now he was an overwhelming presence. Power rolled off him in waves, a palpable force that made the air thicken. He was bigger than she'd imagined, his shoulders broad, his hair as black as a raven's wing. But it was his eyes that captured her. They weren't cold or cruel, but filled with a strange, searching intensity. And then they locked with hers. The moment their eyes locked, the world stopped. It simply ceased to exist. There was no throne room, no guards, no sneering court. There was only him, a bolt of pure energy, hot and white, slammed into her soul. It was a shockwave of recognition, of impossible belonging. A single silent word screamed through every fiber of her being. Mate. Her breath caught, her world tilted on its axis. The man on the throne, the king who held her life in his hands, was the other half of her soul. Her shock was so profound, so absolute, that she could only stare as she saw the same cataclysmic realization dawn in his golden eyes.
He was waiting. The restless energy that had plagued him all day had coiled into a tight knot of anticipation in his gut. The throne room doors opened, and the guards shoved a woman inside. She was a mess. Clad in worn leathers, her face smudged with dirt, her dark hair tangled with leaves. She was a wild thing, dragged from her natural element and thrown before him. The court murmured, their disdain a low hiss. Lord Valerius smirked, no doubt pleased at this public display of an unsuitable female. And then she lifted her head. Her eyes met his. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The polite hum of the court vanished. The weight of his crown disappeared. The cold, empty ache in his soul was engulfed by a supernova of feeling. Her scent, wild pine, clean earth, and a unique fragrance that was hers alone, crashed into him, and his wolf rose up, howling a single triumphant word. Mate. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. Not this exiled trespasser. But the bond, the fated, undeniable bond he had long since given up on, flared to life between them with the force of a physical blow. It was real. She was real. The other half of his soul was kneeling before him in rags, looking at him with the same shattered shock he felt. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken power. He saw her. Not the dirt, not the exile, but the fierce strength in her spine, the fire in her defiant eyes, the beautiful, timeless soul that was the perfect match for his own. A growl rose in his throat, a sound of pure, primal possession. He barely registered the gasps from the court. His entire universe had just narrowed to this one woman. He had to have her. He had to protect her. He had to claim her. Before the words left his lips, he knew they would change everything. They would be an act of war against his council, a challenge to his entire kingdom. He didn't care. He rose from his throne, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the room. A single word that was both a promise and a sentence. Mine. The word hung in the air. A stone dropped into a silent pool. Mine. What followed was chaos. A wave of shocked gasps rippled through the court, a sound like the tide pulling away from the shore. His beta, a steady wolf named Marcus, took a half-step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. But it was the elder council that found their voices first. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of purple fury, surged forward. My king, you cannot be serious. She is a disgraced exile, an elder long past her prime. A growl, low and lethal, ripped from Rorik's chest. It wasn't a sound of the man. It was the beast, the Alpha King, and it silenced the room instantly. Valerius froze, his mouth snapping shut. The air thickened, charged with a power the court had not seen him unleash in years. His world had narrowed to the woman before him, and any threat to her was a threat to him. He stalked down the steps of the throne, his eyes never leaving hers. She was trembling, her wide, terrified eyes locked on his. In that moment, he saw not a mate, but a king. Not a savior, but a master. Not a beginning, but an end. Her fear was a physical blow, a scent of pure terror that his wolf desperately wanted to soothe. But the court was watching. He reached her and his hand shot out, not with violence, but with an unbreakable possessiveness, his fingers curling around her arm. Her skin was soft beneath the grime. The jolt of their first touch was lightning, a fire that raced up his arm and settled deep in his core. She flinched as if burned. Without another word to his stunned court, he began to pull her from the room. His immediate goal was simple: get her away from these vultures, get her somewhere safe, somewhere he could breathe her in. "Rorik, this is madness." Another council member, Lord Aemon, dared to speak. "The laws are clear." "My word is the law," Rorik snarled over his shoulder, his voice a blade of ice. He didn't stop, didn't slow, simply towed her behind him as he stormed towards the massive doors leading to his private wing. He could feel the court's eyes on them, could hear the frantic whispers erupting in his wake. As a result, he knew he had just declared war, and he didn't give a damn. The hollow ache he'd lived with for decades was gone, replaced by this blazing, all-consuming fire. He had found her. He would not lose her.
His touch was a brand. The moment his fingers wrapped around her arm, fire bloomed beneath her skin. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to yield, to submit, to melt into the impossible reality that this was her mate. But her mind, the part of her that had survived 18 years of brutal solitude, shrieked in terror. This was a king, a predator, and she was his prey. He pulled her through the throne room, the hostile faces of the court blurring into a watercolor of hatred and shock. Her feet stumbled on the polished stone, her worn boots a jarring sound in the opulent silence he commanded. She heard the council's protests, heard his feral snarl of a response. This was happening too fast. Her thoughts spun, a whirlwind of disbelief and rising panic. No, no, no. He dragged her through a series of grand hallways, the tapestries on the walls depicting glorious wolf hunts and ancient battles. She felt like one of the cornered deer in the weavings, her fate sealed. He didn't stop until they reached a set of massive, iron-banded doors. He shoved them open and pulled her inside, the doors slamming shut behind them with a deafening boom that echoed the slamming of her own cage. They were in his private chambers. The room was vast, dominated by a huge hearth and a massive bed. Furs were draped over chairs, and the scent of old books, wood smoke, and him, oh gods, him, was overwhelming. Her wolf pressed forward, desperate to get closer to that scent, to the source of the bond that sang in her veins. But she couldn't. She ripped her arm from his grasp, stumbling backward until her back hit the cold stone wall. Her chest ached with the effort to breathe. "No," she whispered, the word a ragged, desperate plea. He turned to her, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. The kingly authority was gone, replaced by something far more raw. Primal. "No," he repeated, his voice a low growl. "You have to let me go," she gasped, her hands held up as if to ward him off. You can't do this. I am an exile, a disgrace. They said I was too old. They're right." Her voice trembled, cracking on the last word. She didn't know what scared her more, his power, or the part of her that yearned for him. He took a step closer, and the space between them burned. "I don't care what they said. I care what the bond says. It says you are mine." "The bond is a mistake," she cried, her voice rising with hysteria. She tried to pull away from him because every instinct for self-preservation told her she was a danger to him. "I will ruin you. Your council will tear you from the throne. They will use me to destroy everything you are." Without warning, he closed the distance between them, his hands planting on the wall on either side of her head, caging her in. His face was inches from hers, his scent a dizzying storm. Her pulse raced, a frantic bird trapped in her throat. "Then let them try," he murmured, his voice dropping to a husky whisper that vibrated through her bones. "They will find that I am not so easily broken." Under the weight of his stare, she felt her resolve begin to crumble, and she let it happen.
Her fear was a poison in the air. He could taste it, smell it, and it drove his wolf mad. He had brought her to safety, to his personal sanctuary, and still she looked at him as if he were the executioner. Her words were daggers, each one a denial of the miracle that had just occurred. A mistake? How could she call this a mistake? "There is no mistake," he said, his voice softer now, trying to soothe the wild terror in her eyes. He fought the urge to touch her, to pull her against him and force her to feel the rightness of the bond. He refused to let her go because his wolf, his very soul, would not allow his mate to be harmed or frightened, even by herself. "This is fate, Lyra." Her name hung in the air, a thing of beauty he had not known he was waiting to speak, but it only seemed to agitate her more. "My name is a curse in this citadel," she shot back, pushing against his chest. It was like a butterfly pushing against an oak tree. "Don't you understand? For 18 years I have been nothing, a ghost, a creature of the woods. I don't know how to be this. I don't know how to be a Luna, a queen." To make things worse, her voice broke, and a tear, a single perfect drop of despair, traced a path through the dirt on her cheek. In the span of a breath, his frustration melted into a fierce, protective ache. He saw it then. It wasn't him she was afraid of. It was the crown, the court, the title, the world that had hurt her so badly before. In that moment, he wanted to burn that world down for her. "I will teach you," he said simply. He lifted a hand, his movement slow, deliberate. His thumb brushed away her tear, his touch surprisingly gentle. Her skin was electric. "I will stand between you and the entire world. No one will harm you. Not my council, not my court. No one." She shook her head, a violent, desperate motion. "You can't. You are one wolf. They are a pack of jackals, and they are already planning how to use me to bleed you." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. If you have any wisdom, if you care at all for your kingdom, you will reject me, publicly, cast me out again. It's the only way." That was it, the final straw. The idea of letting her go, of casting her back into the lonely darkness she'd endured for so long, was so abhorrent that his control snapped. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "Never." Before she could react, his head dipped, and his lips claimed hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a brand, a claim, a desperate, furious attempt to silence her fears and speak the language of the bond, the only truth that mattered. He poured all his loneliness, all his longing, all his fierce, possessive need into it. Her lips were soft, hesitant for a moment, and then, with a broken sob, she yielded.
His kiss was a cataclysm. It shattered her fear and her resolve, replacing it with a wildfire of sensation she was completely unprepared for. Her mind went blank. All the reasons she should fight, all the arguments she had, burned away by the raw, desperate heat of his mouth on hers. The bond, which she had been trying so hard to deny, roared to life inside her, a triumphant tide of belonging that drowned her in its wake. Her hands, which had been pushing against his chest, fisted in his tunic. She kissed him back, not with grace or skill, but with 18 years of pent-up loneliness, of silent starvation for a touch, a connection. It was everything. It was terrifying. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless, the air between them crackling with what he had just unleashed. Her lips tingled, her body thrummed, and her heart ached with a terrifying, beautiful hope. But then, the boom of the chamber doors being thrown open shattered the moment. Lord Valerius stood in the doorway, his face pale with fury. Behind him stood Lord Aemon and 3 other members of the Elder Council. Their eyes were like chips of ice. "King Rorik," Valerius said, his voice dripping with venom. "We will not allow this. You have brought a blight into this citadel. The council demands you perform the rite of rejection. Now, before this filth taints the throne forever." Before the words left her lips, she knew this was the true test. She saw the lines of battle being drawn, and she was the battlefield. Her brief, beautiful hope died. replaced by the cold, hard certainty that she had been right all along. She was going to be the death of him.
Rage, pure, black, and absolute, crashed over him. He turned slowly, his body a coiled spring of lethal intent, to face the 5 council members who dared to stand in his private chambers, who dared to call his mate filth. The kiss, the fragile connection he had just forged with her, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The air crackled, heavy with the promise of violence. "Get out," he commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl that was more beast than man. He was the king, he was the alpha, and he was her mate. In that moment he felt he could tear them limb from limb. Lord Valerius, to his credit, held his ground, his face pale, but his eyes burning with righteous fury. "You are compromising the stability of this kingdom for an aging, barren exile. The law gives us the right." "The law?" Rorik took a step toward them, a predator stalking his prey. "You speak to me of laws? You, who have schemed in the shadows since my father's reign to weaken the throne for your own gain?" He let that accusation hang in the air, a poisoned dart. He saw the flicker of fear in their eyes. They had underestimated him. "There is a new law in this citadel. She is my mate. She is your future queen. Anyone who speaks a word against her answers to me. Now, for the last time, get out." He didn't need to shout. The chilling finality in his tone was enough. They backed away, their political maneuvering crumbling in the face of his absolute primal authority. Valerius gave him one last look of pure hatred before turning and leading the others out, slamming the doors behind them. The silence they left behind was deafening. He turned back to Lyra. She was pressed against the wall as if she wanted to melt into the stone, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that cut him deeper than any blade. He had defended her, had declared war for her, and she looked more afraid than ever. As the silence stretched, he realized the truth. He had just proven her point. She was a source of conflict, and he had just shown her how brutal that conflict would be.
She watched them go, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scene had been more terrifying than facing down a starved bear. The raw, untamed power that had rolled off Rorik was breathtaking, and it was all directed at men who opposed her. The weight of it was crushing. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, she wanted to be back in the silence of her woods. In the quiet that followed, he turned to her, his rage slowly banking, replaced by a look of grim determination. He said nothing, simply crossed the room and poured 2 goblets of wine, his movements stiff. He offered one to her. Her hand trembled as she took it. "He was right, you know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Valerius, I probably am barren, after all this time." She couldn't finish the sentence. It was the great unspoken fear of every she-wolf who passed her prime without a mate. Rorik's jaw clenched. "I do not care." "You should," she insisted, a spark of her old fire returning. "A king needs heirs. Your entire kingdom needs heirs. This isn't just about a bond. It's about a dynasty." She argued with him because his attempts to protect her felt like he was trying to cage her, to blind her to the reality of their situation. "Enough," he said, his voice flat. He gestured to a small door she hadn't noticed. "Those are your chambers. A bath has been drawn. We will speak more in the morning." It was a dismissal, a king's command. And after the display she'd just witnessed, she didn't have the strength to argue. She fled into the adjoining room, the scent of him and the memory of his kiss burning in her mind. Come morning, everything felt worse. Servants, their faces carefully blank, entered her new chambers. They laid out a dress of midnight blue silk that felt as foreign as a snake's skin. She hated it instantly because it felt like a costume for a part she didn't know how to play. The lead servant, a severe-looking woman, avoided Lyra's eyes, her disapproval a suffocating cloud in the room. Deep down, she knew the truth. To them, she was not a queen-to-be. She was a problem. A wild animal the king had dragged home, and they were all waiting to see when he would finally put it out of its misery.
He had arranged the private dinner with meticulous care. No servants, just the two of them in a small firelit dining room. He wanted to show her the man, not the king. He wanted to see her relax, to see the wild creature in her eyes soften with trust. But the moment she walked in, wearing the silk dress he'd chosen, he knew he had made a mistake. She moved like a wolf in a snare, her body stiff, her face a mask of strained composure. The dress was beautiful on her, but it was a cage of fabric, and he saw that now. They sat, and the silence was a chasm between them. The food was tasteless, the wine was sour, and the company was suffocating, or at least the tension was. Finally, he couldn't stand it. "You are unhappy," he stated, his voice rougher than he intended. She looked up, her eyes flashing with a surprising amount of anger. "Unhappy? I am a prisoner, Rorik. I have been taken from a world where I knew how to survive and thrown into one where every breath is a test I am failing. I am trying to give you everything," he countered, his frustration boiling over. "A home, safety, comfort." "I had a home," she shot back, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the stone floor. "It wasn't a castle, but it was mine. I had safety because I was invisible, and I don't want comfort, I want freedom." He stood to face her, his own temper rising. "And what? You want to go back to sleeping in caves and hunting squirrels? To growing old and dying alone in those woods?" The words were cruel, and he knew it the second they left his mouth. Her face crumpled, the pain in her eyes so profound it struck him like a physical blow. Her greatest fear, her deepest insecurity, and he had just thrown it in her face like a weapon. "Lyra, Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "That is exactly what I want, because at least I was just old. Here, I am too old." Before either could speak again, the anguish in her eyes, the raw vulnerability, broke through his anger and his pride. As if pulled by a string, he crossed the space between them in two long strides. He didn't know what to say, how to fix the wounds he had just deepened. So he did the only thing he could. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words raw, honest. "I am not good at this." Her breath hitched, a soft, broken sound. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, her fingers curling into his tunic. The anger between them had burned away, leaving only this fragile, aching need. The tension broke, and he lowered his head, his lips finding hers again, not with the furious passion of before, but with a desperate, questioning tenderness.
His apology was more shocking than his anger. The kiss was her undoing. It wasn't a claim this time, it was a plea, a confession of his own failing. And as his lips moved against hers, gently, tenderly, the fight went out of her. She let herself feel it, the bond, the undeniable pull of her soul toward his. She leaned into him, her body, for the first time, not fighting the connection. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his hard chest, and she felt a sense of safety so profound it made her want to weep. For a single, stolen moment, she wasn't an exile, or too old, or a political problem. She was just his. When the kiss ended, he kept her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I will do better," he vowed into her hair. "I will learn." She didn't know if she believed him. She didn't know if it was even possible. But in the warm circle of his arms, she wanted to. And maybe, she thought, as her wolf stirred with a soft, purring contentment, maybe that was a start. But the peace was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a raging river, and she knew it wouldn't last. It didn't last. 2 nights later, Rorik insisted she attend a small formal gathering in one of the Citadel's grand halls. A test, he'd called it. A chance for the court to begin to see her as he did. To her, it felt like being led to slaughter. She wore another silk dress, this one the color of blood, and felt every eye in the room dissect her. They didn't see a queen. They saw her age, her rough hands, the wildness that still clung to her despite the fine clothes. She stood by Rorik's side, a silent, decorative thing, while he spoke with his lords. The air was thick with perfume and hypocrisy. Then, a path cleared, and Lord Valerius approached, a cruel smirk on his face. Beside him was a young she-wolf, so beautiful it was almost painful to look at. This had to be his daughter, Cressa. "Your Majesty," Valerius said to Rorik, though his cold eyes were fixed on Lyra. "May I present my daughter, Cressa?" Cressa curtsied, a picture of youthful grace. Then she smiled at Lyra, a bright, venomous thing. "It is an honor," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "We are all so relieved that the king has finally found someone, even after so long." The emphasis was a perfectly aimed dart. Lyra's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She said nothing, but Cressa wasn't finished. She tilted her head, her expression one of faux concern. "It must be so difficult adjusting to all this, but I'm sure your life experience will be a great asset. After all, a king needs a wise counselor, especially when the matter of securing the future of the royal bloodline becomes a pressing concern." The insult was breathtaking in its cruelty. Wise counselor. She was calling Lyra old, a glorified nanny, and the mention of the bloodline was a direct public attack on her age and her perceived barrenness. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. She felt Rorik tense beside her, a low growl starting in his chest, but before he could speak, Lyra found her voice. It was quiet, dangerously soft. "And a kingdom needs a queen with the strength to endure," Lyra said, meeting the younger wolf's gaze without flinching. "Not just a pretty face who has never known a day of hardship in her life." A collective gasp went through the small crowd around them. Cressa's perfect smile faltered, her eyes flashing with fury. For a brief second, Lyra felt a surge of triumph. She had fought back. But as she looked around at the shocked and disapproving faces of the other courtiers, the triumph curdled into cold dread. She hadn't won anything. She had just confirmed their worst fears. She wasn't a queen. She was a feral wolf, unfit for their civilized world. And she had just bared her teeth in the middle of their court.
He had never been more proud in his life. He felt Lyra tense, heard Cressa's vicious, honey-coated words, and his rage began to spike. He was about to put the girl and her father in their place, to command them from his sight, when Lyra spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of obsidian. The words were perfectly chosen, a verbal blade that slid right between Cressa's ribs. He saw the shock on Cressa's face, the fury in Valerius's eyes, and in that moment, he didn't see an exile. He saw his queen, a warrior who could fight with words as well as she could with claws. On the other hand, he saw the reaction of the court. They were horrified. They saw her response not as clever or strong, but as uncivilized, uncouth. They didn't see a queen defending her honor. They saw a wild animal snapping at one of their own. He felt Lyra withdraw into herself, the brief fire in her eyes extinguished by the cold wave of their judgment. He rested his hand on the small of her back, a silent sign of his support, of his pride. But he knew the damage was done. This was her first test, and while she had passed it in his eyes, she had failed it in the eyes of his world. As the partygoers gave them a wide berth, whispering behind their fans, he knew this was just the beginning. The battle for her acceptance, and for his throne, was going to be far bloodier than he had imagined.
The party was a disaster. That night, sleep refused to come. The memory of Cressa's cruel, smiling face and the court's cold, judging eyes played over and over in her mind. She felt a phantom itch under her skin, the silk of the dress a memory of a cage she couldn't escape. She needed air. She needed the sky. Before she could think, her body moved on instinct. She slipped out of her chambers and found her way to the royal gardens, a manicured space that felt like a pale imitation of her wild woods. Still, the scent of damp earth and night-blooming moon petal was a balm to her frayed nerves. She sought solitude in the garden because the stone walls of the citadel felt suffocating, each hallway a new kind of trap. The moon was a silver coin in the dark sky. Shadows danced between the sculpted hedges, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of peace. But then, a scent. It was faint, almost lost beneath the flowers, but her wolf recognized it. A strange wolf, not from the citadel guard, and it was laced with something else, something cold and sharp, like bloodlust. Her breath caught. Her instincts, honed by 2 decades of survival, screamed at her, danger. She turned slowly, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Was she imagining it? Was the stress of this place finally making her lose her mind? Maybe it was. Without warning, a shadow detached itself from a thicket of rose bushes. A figure clad in dark, nondescript clothing lunged at her. A glint of moonlight on steel, a dagger. Her world narrowed to that single point of light. Without thinking, she threw herself sideways, the blade slicing through the air where her heart had been a second before. She hit the ground hard, rolling, her borrowed silk dress ripping at the seams. Fury, hot and clean, surged through her, chasing away the fear. This was a language she understood, a fight for survival. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing a heavy stone from the edge of the path. The assassin moved with a wolf's speed, closing the distance again. He was faster, stronger. She braced herself for the end. But then, a blur of motion from the castle doors and a roar that was not human.
He couldn't sleep. The image of Lyra's face after Cress's attack, the brief fire followed by that devastating wounded look, was burned into his mind. He had failed to protect her. He had thrown her into a pit of vipers and called it a party. As the silence in his chambers stretched, a primal unease settled in his gut. His wolf was agitated, pacing, demanding he go to her. He rose from his bed and went to her chambers. They were empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. Where would she go? The gardens. Her scent, though faint, led him there. As he pushed open the heavy doors to the terrace, he heard it. A scuffle, the tear of fabric. And he saw them. A shadowy figure with a blade, and Lyra, fierce and defiant with a rock in her hand. A killing rage, so pure and absolute it stole his breath, eclipsed every other thought. He didn't remember moving. He was a storm, a force of nature, a king defending his queen. He hit the assassin with the force of a battering ram, sending the man flying into a stone fountain. The dagger clattered across the flagstones. Before the assassin could recover, Rorik was on him, his hands closing around the man's throat, a feral snarl ripping from his lips. "Who sent you?" he roared, his voice a promise of a slow and painful death. The man choked, his eyes wide with terror. He was a shifter, but a weak one, no match for a true alpha. "Tell me," Rorik squeezed, the man's bones groaning under the pressure. Behind him, he heard Lyra's sharp intake of breath. He was losing control. The alpha was demanding blood. But for her, he reined it in. With a final, disgusted snarl, he slammed the assassin's head against the stone, knocking him unconscious. He rose, his chest heaving, his body thrumming with violent adrenaline. He turned to Lyra. She was staring at him, not with fear as he had expected, but with a look of wide-eyed awe. In that moment, he wasn't a king in a castle. He was her mate, her protector, and he had just shown her how far he would go to keep her safe. The attack was horrifying, but because of that, a new unbreakable thread of trust was woven between them in the dark, moonlit garden.
The aftermath of the attack was a blur of motion and grim-faced guards. Rorik had interrogated the would-be assassin, who, under the crushing weight of an alpha's command, had confessed he was hired through a chain of contacts, but the gold smelled of the Elder Council. It was proof, but not enough to act on publicly. What's worse, the attack left Lyra with a gnawing, desperate need for answers. Her past was no longer a ghost she could ignore. It was a weapon being used against her and the man she was coming to care for. She had to know why. What had she truly done to inspire this level of hatred? A hatred that had festered for 18 years. That's why the next day she went to Rorik. "I need to know about my old pack," she said, her voice resolute. "Everything. The alpha who exiled me, who was on his council. I need to understand." Rorik looked at her, his golden eyes searching hers. He saw not a victim, but a warrior seeking intelligence. A slow nod. "I will grant you access to the royal archives, and to Ilara, the keeper." Ilara was an ancient she-wolf, her silver fur the color of spun moonlight, her eyes holding the wisdom of centuries. She led Lyra into the archives, a vast circular room that smelled of old paper and dust. The entire history of the Pax was kept here. For hours, Lyra pored over old scrolls and ledgers, her search fruitless. There was plenty on her Pax's decline in trade, but nothing on the politics, nothing on her. "What is it you are truly looking for, child?" Ilara asked, her voice soft as rustling leaves. "The truth," Lyra whispered. "I feel like a piece of my life is missing." Ilara's gaze was kind. "Sometimes the most important truths are not in the official records. They are in the words left unsaid." She gestured to a small, dusty chest in the corner. "These are personal effects, journals collected from lines that have ended." A cold premonition washed over Lyra. She approached the chest. Inside, tucked beneath a folded piece of embroidery, was a small leather-bound journal. The leather was worn, the clasp a simple silver moon, her mother's. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with her mother's elegant script, recipes, notes about the seasons, mundane daily life. But then, the tone shifted. The writing grew hurried, frantic. "The council grows bold," she read. "They whisper of the old blood. They look at my Lyra, and I see fear in their eyes. Her defiance of the Alpha is the excuse they need. They speak of the prophecy of the Moonfang." Lyra's breath caught. Moonfang, an ancient rival clan, brutally subjugated generations ago, their bloodline supposedly wiped out. She turned the page, her heart pounding. The last entry was dated the day before her exile. They will kill her. They see her as a threat, a resurgence of the old power. Her father and I have made a terrible choice. We will use her defiance as a pretext. We will support the Alpha's decree. We will cast our own daughter out, because it is the only way to make them believe she is worthless, the only way to keep her alive. I pray the wilderness hides you, my sweet girl. I pray it keeps you safe until a king worthy of your strength can see past the exile and recognize the queen you were born to be. Forgive us." The journal slipped from her fingers. The room spun. It was not a punishment, but a protection. Not a mark of shame, but a shield of love. Not an ending, but a hidden beginning. Her entire life, the very foundation of her identity as a worthless exile, was a lie.
He had given her space, but he could not stay away. He found her in the archives, standing as still as a statue, her face a mask of utter devastation. The old keeper, Ilara, gave him a solemn, knowing look and retreated, leaving them alone. "Lyra?" he said softly. She looked up at him, and her eyes were a storm of emotions he couldn't begin to name. Grief, rage, betrayal, and a stunning, terrifying power. She didn't speak, she simply held out the journal. He read the final entry, and the political chessboard of his kingdom didn't just rearrange itself, it was shattered. The council's fear of her wasn't just prejudice, it was a deep historical terror of a bloodline they thought they had destroyed. The Moonfang Alpha line. A line said to possess a unique connection to the moon goddess, a power that could challenge any king. And Lyra was its last daughter. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and he saw it. Not the dirt-streaked exile, not the haunted woman from the woods. He saw the descendant of powerful alphas, a queen in her own right, hidden away for her own protection. As the truth unraveled, he knew the war had truly begun. They sat in his solar that night, the journal resting on the table between them like a sacred relic. The air was charged, the silence filled with the weight of 18 stolen years. He saw the truth in her eyes, he felt the power in her blood, and he understood the depth of the council's treachery. They hadn't just exiled a defiant girl, they had tried to erase a legacy. "They feared you," he said, his voice raw with the revelation. "All this time it wasn't about your age or your defiance. They feared your blood, your birthright." He finally understood why his wolf had recognized her so instantly, so completely. Her soul wasn't just his mate, it was his equal in power and lineage. "My parents," she whispered, her voice thick with a grief that was 2 decades old. "They let me hate them. They let me think I was nothing. To save me." The pain in her voice was a physical thing, and he had to fight the urge to pull her into his arms. This was a grief she had to walk through on her own. "They gave you the skills to survive," he countered gently. "They trusted you would be strong enough to endure the wilderness. They trusted that fate would bring you here." He believed it with every fiber of his being. Her exile wasn't a tragedy. It was a forge that had made her unbreakable. A new fire began to burn in her eyes, chasing away the sorrow. It was the cold, clear fire of rage. "Valerius," she breathed. "His father was on the council that supported my exile. This isn't just politics for him. It's an old blood feud." "Yes," Rorik agreed, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. Now they had a specific target, a reason. He doesn't just want you gone. He wants you erased, just like his father tried to do. As the silence roared between them, something shifted. The dynamic between them was no longer king and consort, protector and victim. They were 2 sides of the same coin, 2 alphas bound by fate and now united by a common ancient enemy. They became true allies because they now had a shared, powerful secret that could either unite the kingdom or tear it apart.
His words were an anchor in the storm of her emotions. He wasn't trying to soften the blow or pity her. He was meeting her on this new ground as an equal. He saw the truth, and he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready for the war it heralded. For the first time since she was 20 years old, she didn't feel alone. She looked at him, at this powerful alpha king who had claimed her, defended her, and now saw her for who she truly was. The bond pulsed between them, no longer a source of fear, but a current of shared strength. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady, clear. It was the question of a partner, a strategist, a queen. Rorik's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. It was the smile of a wolf who was about to go on the hunt. "Now," he said, his golden eyes locking with hers, a silent vow passing between them. "Now, we give them a reason to be afraid. They had a reason to be afraid, and she was going to give it to them." For 2 days, she and Rorik had been allies, partners, poring over the old scrolls and treaties from the archives. The truth of her bloodline wasn't just a shield, it was a sword. Rorik had called a full council meeting to discuss a land dispute on the southern border, a proposal submitted by Lord Valerius himself. She knew it was a dry, boring political maneuver designed to line his own pockets. But deep within the treaty connected to that land was a forgotten clause. A clause only the last daughter of the Moonfangs would know. She walked into the council chamber beside Rorik, her head held high. She wore simple, dark leathers, not the silk of the court. This was her armor. The whispers ceased the moment they entered. She could feel the council's eyes on her, a mix of contempt and a new, wary curiosity. Lord Valerius presented his case, his voice smooth and confident. He proposed annexing a strip of unclaimed forest, arguing it would provide better security for the border. What's worse, she knew he planned to harvest the ancient ironwood trees there for himself. When he finished, a smug look on his face, Rorik turned his gaze to her, a silent cue. This was her moment. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "Lord Valerius," she began, and the entire council flinched, shocked that she would dare to speak. "You call that land unclaimed?" Valerius scoffed. "It has been empty for a century, a wasteland since the Northern Ridgepack fell into ruin." "It is not unclaimed," Lyra stated, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. "It is protected. Under the First Treaty, Article 4, that land was ceded to the kingdom on the condition it remain a wild sanctuary, a sacred hunting ground in honor of the Moonfang Packs who gave their lives to secure it." She challenged Valerius because she knew his proposal violated an ancient treaty connected to her own bloodline, and it was the perfect way to reveal her new power. A stunned, absolute silence fell over the room. Valerius's jaw went slack. He stared at her as if she were a ghost. The other lords were just as shocked because they had dismissed her as an uneducated wildling, a creature of instinct, not intellect. She took a step forward. She spoke not with the arrogance of a courtier, but with the quiet authority of her ancestors, with the unshakable certainty of the truth. "To claim that land is to spit on the graves of my ancestors. The treaty is magically bound. To break it would bring a curse upon that land and all who profit from it." Without another word, she turned and walked back to Rorik's side. He didn't smile, but his golden eyes burned with a pride so intense it felt like a physical touch. She had not just defeated Valerius's proposal, she had announced, without ever saying her name, that a Moonfang walked among them once more. The game had changed, and from the look of pure, murderous hatred on Valerius's face, she knew it had just become infinitely more dangerous.
He had known she was magnificent, but he had not been prepared for the sight of her dismantling his oldest enemy with the elegance of a master strategist. She had used their own laws, their own history, against them, and she had done it without raising her voice, without a single threat. The power she wielded was quiet, ancient, and utterly terrifying to men like Valerius. As they left the council chamber, the lords parted before them, their faces a mixture of fear and a new, grudging respect. He felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. She was no longer just his mate. She was a power in her own right. More importantly, she was a mystery they couldn't solve, and it made them afraid. That night, he found her staring into the fire in her chambers, a goblet of wine untouched in her hand. The victory in the council had faded, leaving a familiar sadness in its wake. He knew she was thinking of her parents, of the life she should have had. "They would be proud of you," he said softly, coming to stand behind her chair. "They're dead," she whispered, her voice thick. "And I'm just a ghost playing a queen." "No," he said, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "You are a queen who was forced to play a ghost." He gently kneaded the tension from her shoulders. "I, on the other hand, am a king who has been playing the part for so long I sometimes forget the man." She looked up at him, her curiosity piqued. As if fate demanded it, he knew he had to show her the truth of his own exile, the prison of his crown. The moment was too important to let pass. "My father was a great alpha," he began, his voice low, the words tasting strange in his mouth. He never spoke of this. "But he was a force of nature, a storm. He loved my mother, but he ruled alone. When he died, the silence he left behind was deafening." He moved to sit in the chair opposite her, the firelight dancing between them. "I was young. The council, Valerius's father among them, saw their chance. They tried to rule through me, to make me a puppet king. I spent 10 years fighting them, not just for my throne, but for my own soul." He shared his past because he needed her to see the man behind the crown, to know she wasn't his only salvation, but his partner. "These rooms," he gestured around the opulent chamber. "They were a prison long before you arrived, Lyra, the loneliest place in the entire kingdom." He was her king, her protector, and now, in the quiet of the night, he was simply Rorik, a man who was just as scarred as she was. He was confessing his own vulnerability, offering it to her as a sign of absolute trust. She listened, her eyes never leaving his face, and he saw a profound empathy in their depths. As the silence stretched, she finally spoke, her own voice a soft whisper of memory.
His confession cracked something open inside her. He wasn't just a king, he was a survivor, just like her. His vulnerability made her feel safe enough to share her own scars, a thing she had never done with another living soul. There was a winter, she began, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Maybe the 3rd or 4th year of my exile. The snow was so deep I couldn't hunt for a week. I was starving, so cold my bones felt like ice. She wrapped her arms around herself, the memory a phantom chill. I found a shallow cave and I just lay there. I was ready to die. It felt easier than fighting for another day, another meal, another lonely sunrise. Her voice trembled. But then, my wolf. She wouldn't let me. She pushed me, forced me to my feet. I remember digging through the snow with my bare hands, searching for frozen berries, anything. I survived. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. But a part of me died in that cave, the part that hoped. Before she could move, he was kneeling before her, his large, warm hands covering her own. He didn't offer platitudes or pity. He simply looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a fierce, profound understanding that went deeper than words. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, the mate bond was a quiet hum in the background. What flared between them was something else entirely. It was love. A love born not of fate, but of shared scars, of mutual respect, of two lonely souls finally finding their other half in the darkness. Without thinking, she leaned forward, and he met her halfway. The kiss was not like the others. It was not a claim, not a battle, not a desperate plea. It was a promise, a homecoming. It was slow and deep, and it healed parts of her she thought had been dead for years. And as he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed, she knew she wasn't a ghost anymore. She was home. Their night together had changed everything. For the first time, the Citadel felt less like a prison and more like a home. A fragile peace settled over her. But she knew Valerius was a snake coiled in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before he struck. The attack came 2 days later, not with a blade, but with a public declaration that was far more deadly. Rorik had convened a grand assembly to announce new trade routes, a display of strength and stability. The entire court was present. They had just finished the formal announcements when Lord Valerius stepped into the center of the floor. His daughter, Cressa, was at his side, looking pale and determined. A wave of unease rippled through the hall. "Your Majesty," Valerius called out, his voice ringing with false piety. "The council and I have been concerned, deeply concerned, about the future of the royal line." Rorik, standing beside Lyra on the dais, went still. His hand found hers, his grip like iron. "Your chosen mate," Valerius continued, pointing a dramatic finger at Lyra, "is of a noble if forgotten line, but she is of a certain age. The kingdom needs the security of knowing their king can produce an heir, an alpha to follow him." The insult was a physical blow, a public branding of her deepest insecurity. The entire court was silent, watching, waiting. "Therefore," Valerius boomed, "as is my right by ancient law, I invoke the right of provocation. I offer my daughter Cressa, young, strong, and fertile, to challenge for the position of Luna Queen and secure the future of our people." A collective, horrified gasp swept the room. It was a desperate, archaic move, a public slap in the face to the king. To make things worse, Valerius had framed it as an act of patriotism, of concern for the kingdom. He had weaponized her age and her barrenness, turning her into a national security threat. This was his checkmate.
A red haze of fury descended over him. The right of provocation. It was a dusty, barbaric law that hadn't been invoked in 500 years. It was a direct challenge, not just to Lyra, but to his authority as king, to his choice, to their bond. He felt Lyra flinch beside him, could feel her shame and humiliation as if it were his own. In that moment, he wanted to tear Valerius's throat out in front of the entire court. But he was a king. He had to be more than a beast. He squeezed Lyra's hand, a silent promise. I have you. He stepped forward, his voice dangerously calm, a quiet rumble that was somehow more terrifying than a roar. Lord Valerius, you invoke a law that was created for times of war and desperation, when a king's line was the only thing holding a pack together. He let his gaze sweep over the assembled lords. Are you saying our kingdom is so weak? Are you saying your king is so incompetent that he cannot secure his own future? He turned his burning gaze back to Valerius. You do not do this out of concern for the kingdom. You do this out of greed and a pathetic lust for power. Then, his voice dropped to a lethal growl. Your provocation is an insult. Your challenge is an act of treason. He pointed a single, commanding finger at the doors. I strip you of your titles and your land. You and your daughter are exiled from this city. Be gone by sunrise, or I will consider you an enemy of the crown and hunt you down myself. The finality of his decree was absolute. Valerius stood, his face a mask of shocked fury, his desperate gambit having failed so spectacularly. But as he and his daughter were escorted out by the royal guard, Rorik knew this was not the end. He had won the battle, but Valerius had started a war. He had publicly planted the seed of doubt, the idea of the barren queen, and that was a poison that would be hard to suck out.
The quiet that followed Valerius's exile was not peace. It was the eerie, unnatural calm before a hurricane. For 3 days, the court was a sea of whispers and sideways glances. Lords who had once been friendly to Rorik now offered stiff, formal bows. The poison of doubt, the idea of the barren queen, the unsuitable mate, had been released into the air, and everyone was breathing it in. Lyra felt the chill of it everywhere. She stayed by Rorik's side, a silent shadow, but she knew her presence was a constant, grating reminder of the king's defiance. She was not a queen, but a curse. Not a mate, but a burden. Not a partner, but a poison that would destroy him. No matter how hard she tried to believe in his strength, her old fears were creeping back, cold and familiar. Then, on the 4th day, the hurricane hit. A guard, his armor rent and his face caked in blood and mud, burst into the throne room, stumbling to his knees before Rorik. Your Majesty, the western outpost, at Black Creek, it's been overrun. A wave of alarm went through the assembled court. Rorik was on his feet in an instant. By whom? The Bloodfangs, sire, the guard choked out. They came out of the haunted woods, a war party. They slaughtered everyone. Horror, cold and absolute, washed over Lyra. The Bloodfangs were a savage, half-mad pack of exiles and madmen, more myth than reality. But then, the throne room doors burst open again. This time, it was a group of Rorik's patrol guards, dragging a captured Bloodfang warrior between them. The creature was huge, scarred and snarling, his eyes wild with hate. We found this one near the village, my king, the patrol captain announced. He carried something. We thought you should see it. He held up a tattered, blood-soaked banner. The moment she saw it, Lyra's blood turned to ice. It was the sigil of her ancestors, a silver wolf howling at a crescent moon, the mark of the moon fang. To make things worse, the captured warrior spat a mouthful of blood on the floor and laughed, a ragged, terrible sound. He pointed a clawed finger at Lyra. She called us, he roared, his voice thick with a rehearsed lie. The lost daughter. She promised us blood and land for our help. She is the one who led us here. The accusation was a thunderclap in the silent room. Every eye turned to her. In their faces, she saw not disbelief, but a dawning, horrified certainty. The frame-up was effective because it played on the court's existing fear of her otherness and her rival bloodline. It was a perfect, elegant, and utterly devastating lie.
Rage was too small a word. What he felt was a fury so profound it threatened to unmake him. He knew with the unshakable certainty of his bond to Lyra that this was a lie. A vicious, calculated performance orchestrated by the exiled Valerius. The Bloodfangs were known to sell their savagery to the highest bidder, and Valerius had paid in gold and lies. He saw the fear and accusation in the eyes of his court, and his heart turned to stone. They were his people, his lords, sworn to him, and they were ready to believe the ravings of a mad dog over the honor of their king and the innocence of their future queen. "Silence!" he roared, and the captured wolf flinched, the alpha command in his voice a physical blow. Rorik strode down from the dais, his eyes blazing. "You will tell me who paid you to carry this banner. You will tell me who paid you to speak this lie." But the warrior only laughed again, a gurgling sound, before his eyes rolled back in his head and his body went limp. A thin line of black foam trickled from his lips. Poison. He'd taken it before he was captured. He was a loose end, already tied and cut. The silence that followed was damning. The proof was gone, but the accusation remained hanging in the air like a shroud. He looked at Lyra. She stood frozen, her face a mask of pale horror, looking at him as if he were the one who had just condemned her. He saw the trust they had built, the love they had shared, begin to crumble under the weight of this lie. And for the first time, a sliver of cold fear pierced his own heart. Valerius hadn't just attacked his kingdom. He had attacked their bond. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. That night, a delegation of his most trusted lords, men whose fathers had served his father, requested an audience. He met them in his solar. Their leader was Lord Kalen, a grizzled old wolf with eyes that had seen 100 winters. He was a man Rorik had always respected. "We do not come as accusers, my king," Kalen began, his voice heavy with regret. "We come as allies, as members of your pack." "Then speak as such," Rorik said, his voice tight. "The lords are afraid," Kalen said bluntly. "The small folk are terrified. The story of the lost daughter and the Bloodfangs is spreading like wildfire. They see her bloodline not as a strength, but as a threat. A civil war is brewing, Rorik. Packs are choosing sides. Valerius, even in exile, has sympathizers." He saw the fear in their eyes, he heard the treason in their words, and he felt the foundation of his kingdom begin to crack. "What is it you want, Kalen?" Rorik asked, though deep down he already knew the truth. Kalen took a deep breath. "Set her aside, publicly, just for a time. Put her in a protected sanctuary until this threat is neutralized and Valerius is brought to justice. Show the Pax that you stand with them, that your first loyalty is to the kingdom." The request was a dagger in his heart. It was reasonable, politically astute, and it was the deepest betrayal he had ever known. Lord Kalen wavered not out of malice, but because his loyalty to his people and the fear of a bloody war outweighed his personal loyalty to his king. Rorik felt trapped, caught between his heart and his crown, and the choice they were asking him to make was impossible. "You ask me to put my own mate in a cage to appease the fears of fools who believe the lies of a traitor," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I ask you to be a king," Kalen countered, his own voice filled with sorrow, "to choose your kingdom over one woman." The meeting ended without a resolution, but the message was clear. His allies were abandoning him. He was alone, with only a handful of loyal guards in a kingdom that was about to tear itself apart.
She watched them leave. From a shadowed alcove down the hall, she had seen the delegation of lords enter the solar. She had seen their grim, determined faces. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they had demanded. The truth was written in the slump of Rorik's shoulders as he stood alone in the doorway after they were gone. They wanted him to get rid of her. The cold dread that had been her companion for so long returned, wrapping around her heart like a vice. She had been right all along. From the very first moment she had known this would happen. She was a blight, a poison, and she was killing him. She was killing his kingdom. All the progress she had made, all the strength she had found in the truth of her past, all the love she felt for him, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the reality of the present. And the reality was, he was losing everything. Because of her. Her core flaw, the deeply ingrained belief that she was unworthy and destructive, rose up and consumed her completely. The evidence was undeniable. She had seen it in the court's eyes. She had heard it in the captured warrior's accusation. And now she could feel it in the betrayal of Rorik's oldest allies. She found him by the fire, staring into the flames, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked up as she entered, and the agony in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. He looked defeated, and it was her fault. Her heart didn't just break. It turned to dust. The decision, when it came, was not a choice. It was an inevitability. It was the only thing she had left to give him. She decided to sacrifice herself because she truly believed it was the only way to save the man she loved from the ruin she was causing. She walked towards him, her movements slow, her body feeling strangely light, as if her soul had already begun to leave it. "Lyra," he began, his voice rough with exhaustion. "They are right," she said, her own voice a quiet, dead thing. "Kaelin, the others, they are right." He stood up, a protest already forming on his lips, but she held up a hand. "No, please. Just listen." She looked at him, memorizing the planes of his face, the fierce gold of his eyes, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair. "The bond is a miracle," she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a cold path down her cheek. "You are the greatest thing that has ever happened to me, Rorik, and because I love you, I have to be the one to end this." His face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. "What are you saying?" "Perform the rite of rejection," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Tell them you have seen the truth. Cast me out. Blame me for everything. It will unite them behind you again. You will be their hero, the king who chose his kingdom over his tainted mate." She took a shaky breath, her entire being focused on getting through this. "I will go. I will go back to the woods and disappear. No one will ever find me. You will be safe. Your kingdom will be whole." She was offering him his life back, a life free of the curse she had brought upon him. He just stared at her, his face completely devoid of expression. The silence roared in her ears, a deafening void where her hope used to be. She had expected him to argue, to rage, to protest, but he did none of those things. He just looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a profound, shattering sadness. In his silence, she heard her own damnation. He was considering it. And in that moment, she knew that all was truly, finally, lost.
Her words were a blade twisting in his gut. "Reject me. Cast me out." He looked at the woman he loved, the other half of his soul, offering to shatter herself to save him. The profound sadness he felt was not for his kingdom, not for his throne, but for her. For the 18 years of exile that had so thoroughly convinced her she was worthless. His silence was not consideration. It was the calm at the center of a storm of rage. A rage directed not at her, but at the world that had done this to her. Instead of agreeing, he closed the distance between them. He reached out, his hands gently cupping her face, forcing her to look at him. Her tear-streaked face, her eyes empty of hope. It was the most painful thing he had ever seen. "No," he said, his voice quiet, but with an undercurrent of unshakable iron. She flinched, a confused frown marring her brow. "But your kingdom, your allies—" "My kingdom is worthless without its heart," he interrupted, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "And you, Lyra, you are its heart." He saw the flicker of disbelief in her eyes and knew he had to make her understand. He refused to reject her because her willingness to sacrifice herself was the ultimate proof of her love and worthiness, not her liability. "Listen to me," he commanded softly. "They miscalculated. Valerius, the council, all of them. They thought you were my weakness, a political problem they could exploit. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling. They were wrong. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his own blazing with a fire she had never seen before. Your love for this pack, your willingness to walk back into the darkness to save it, to save me, that is not weakness, Lyra. That is the strength of a true queen. He would not be the king who sacrificed his heart. He would not be the man who broke his soul, and he would not be the mate who abandoned his other half. You are not my weakness, he declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. You are my strength. You are my war banner, and we are going to take back our home, together.
His words were a tidal wave, crashing against the fortress of her despair and shattering it completely. He wasn't agreeing. He wasn't considering it. He was choosing her. Not just as a mate, but as a partner, as a strength. As the truth of his words sank in, something inside her shifted. The old broken part of her, the part that had died in that frozen cave all those years ago, crumbled to dust. And in its place, a new strength, fierce and bright, rose from the ashes. Lyra's hope was reborn because his absolute faith in her finally allowed her to have faith in herself. A sob, not of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming relief, broke from her lips. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, and for the first time, she truly held on without fear. He held her just as tightly, his arms a circle of unbreakable strength around her. When she finally pulled back, the tears were gone. In their place was a resolve that mirrored his own. The haunted look was gone, replaced by the cool, calculating gaze of a survivor who was finally ready to fight back. "All right," she said, her voice clear and steady. "If they want a war, let's give them one. But we will not fight it here, in this castle of whispers." She looked up at him, a plan already forming in her mind, born from 18 years of solitude. "We will fight it on my territory." An hour later, the solar was transformed into a war room. A massive map of the kingdom was spread across the grand table, but Lyra didn't need it. The map she used was the one etched into her memory. "They will expect us to make a stand here, at the Citadel," she said, tapping the polished stone depiction of the castle, "or to meet them on the open plains to the south. It's traditional, honorable." She scoffed at the word. "They won't be expecting us to choose the Whispering Woods." Rorik came to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid wall of support. "It's a tactical nightmare. Dense, unpredictable, perfect for an ambush." "Exactly," she confirmed, a feral smile touching her lips for the first time. She dragged her finger across the map, tracing a path through the dark green ink that represented the forest. "Valerius will have the Bloodfangs attack from the north, through the haunted forests. He'll expect our forces to be drawn there. But his own men, the Council's loyalists, they won't go that way. They're too disciplined, too afraid of the legends. They will take the old logging road to the east to try and flank us." She looked up at him, her eyes alight with a fire he had never seen. "But they don't know the woods like I do. Not anymore. The logging road washed out a decade ago. It leads directly into the Blackmire swamp." She knew every rock, every stream, every hidden path in that forest. It was no longer her prison. It was her greatest weapon.
He watched her, completely captivated. This was the queen he had seen glimpses of, a brilliant, fierce strategist, using the scars of her past as a weapon for their future. They chose the woods for the final battle because it was the only terrain where Lyra's unique, intimate knowledge gave them a decisive advantage over a larger force. "We can use the Blackmire to trap their main force," he mused, picking up on her strategy instantly. "And the Bloodfangs? The Bloodfangs are savages, but they are predictable." Lyra continued, her voice confident. "They hunt by scent and sound. They move fast, but loud. I know a series of gorges and ravines in the northern woods. A rock slide, started at the right moment, could trap their entire war party with no escape. It was a brilliant high-risk plan. It relied on precision, timing, and her intimate knowledge of the terrain. It was also their only chance. "Marcus," Rorik called. His beta entered the room, his face grim but loyal. "Gather every guard who still stands with the crown. Pack light. We ride in 1 hour." Marcus looked from his king to Lyra, and for the first time, Rorik saw a look of profound respect in his beta's eyes for the woman at his side. He nodded once. "It will be done, my king." As Marcus left, Rorik turned back to Lyra. He took her hand, lifting it to his lips. "They wanted a war," he murmured against her skin. "They just didn't realize they were starting one with 2 alphas."
They rode out under the cover of a moonless sky, a small grim company of 20 wolves against what was likely hundreds. Yet, there was no fear among them. The loyal guards followed them without question because they were inspired by their king's unwavering devotion and their future queen's raw courage. This was not an army marching to its doom. It was a hunting party, moving with silent, deadly purpose. Lyra rode beside Rorik, not behind him. She wore her old leathers, a bow slung over her back and her sharpest hunting knife at her hip. As they crossed the bridge, leaving the city, she didn't look back. There was nothing for her there. Everything she needed, everything she was fighting for, was riding right beside her. The moment they entered the Whispering Woods, the air changed. It was a homecoming. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled her lungs, calming the last of her nerves. This was her world. Here she was not an exile. She was the apex predator. As they moved deeper into the trees, the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft thud of their wolves' paws on the forest floor. They were all in their shifted forms now, moving faster, their senses heightened. Rorik's wolf was immense, a magnificent black creature with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. He ran at her shoulder, a constant, reassuring presence. The tension was a living thing, a coiled snake in the pit of her stomach. They were riding into a trap, a pincer movement designed to crush them. But they had a trap of their own. Still, the risks were enormous. If her timing was off, if the Bloodfangs moved faster than she anticipated, if Valerius had a scout who knew the truth of the logging road, it would all be for nothing.
He ran beside her, his powerful limbs eating up the ground. He could feel the loyalty of the small pack behind him, their courage a tangible force. But more importantly, he felt her resolve, her focus, her complete lack of fear. She moved through the darkness as if she were born to it, her silver-tipped fur almost invisible in the gloom. He knew what the court would think of this. A king, abandoning his mighty fortress to lead a tiny war party into the woods, relying on the word of a disgraced exile. It was madness. It was suicide. But they didn't know Lyra. They didn't know the strength forged in the crucible of this forest. They saw a weakness to be exploited. He saw the weapon that would win them their kingdom back. As if sensing his thoughts, she glanced at him, her intelligent wolf eyes meeting his. In that single glance, a universe of trust and shared purpose passed between them. Without another word, she veered to the left, leading them toward the northern ridges. The first part of their plan was in motion. A lone howl, distant and hungry, echoed through the trees. The Bloodfangs. They had taken the bait. A growl rumbled in Rorik's chest, not of fear, but of savage anticipation. The hunt had begun.
The howl of the Bloodfangs was a promise of death, but in her own woods, Lyra was the one who made the promises. She gave a sharp, barking command to the small force behind her, and they split apart, melting into the trees like ghosts. This was her hunt, her battle, her forest. She was the fury of the storm, the cunning of the wolf, the spirit of the woods. Without warning, the first of the Bloodfangs burst into the clearing. They were huge, mangy creatures, their eyes glowing with a mad light. They charged forward, a wave of claws and teeth, expecting to find a small, terrified group cowering in fear. Instead, they found nothing. From her perch on a high ridge, Lyra watched them pour into the narrow gorge below, just as she'd planned. Rorik and his warriors were creating a diversion at the far end, their roars and snarls drawing the blood fangs deeper into the trap. "Now," she whispered to the two guards beside her. With a coordinated heave, they pushed the massive, precariously balanced boulders at the edge of the ridge. For a moment, there was only the scraping of stone. Then, with a deafening groan, the rocks tumbled into the gorge, bringing half the cliffside down with them. The sound was a thunderclap, and the ground shook. A wall of rock and earth sealed the gorge, trapping the bloodfangs in a dusty tomb. Their howls of rage turned into shrieks of terror. The first pincer of the trap had snapped shut, but there was no time for triumph. A new sound reached her, the sound of armored wolves crashing through the forest. Valerius's men, coming from the east. She raced through the trees, her paws silent on the damp earth, Rorik's scent pulling her forward. She found him facing down a group of 5 wolves wearing the council's silver armor. They had him surrounded. He fought like a demon, a whirlwind of black fur and fury, but he was outnumbered. Her heart skipped. As she prepared to launch herself into the fray, her eyes caught a flicker of movement in the trees behind Rorik. A 6th wolf. A traitor from Rorik's own guard, his face a mask of grim determination as he raised a silver dagger for a killing blow. Rorik was engaged. He couldn't see it. Before she could think, her body moved on instinct. She was no longer a queen or a mate. She was a hunter. She launched herself through the air, a silver-furred missile of pure protective fury. She hit the traitor with the force of a falling tree, her teeth sinking into the shoulder of his weapon arm. The dagger flew from his grasp. He roared in pain and shock, but it was too late. In the span of a breath, Rorik spun around, his eyes blazing, and finished the fight. He was safe. Lyra saved Rorik because her senses, honed by years of brutal survival, detected the hidden threat that he, in the heat of battle, had missed.
He felt the killing blow coming a split second before it landed, a scent of betrayal in the air. He braced for the impact, but it never came. Instead, he heard a familiar, furious snarl and the sickening crunch of teeth on bone. He spun to see Lyra, his fierce, magnificent mate, disabling the traitor who would have ended his life. A love so powerful, so absolute, surged through him that it nearly brought him to his knees. She was magnificent. What followed was not a battle. It was a rout. The remaining council loyalists, seeing their ace assassin defeated and hearing the terrified screams from the trapped bloodfangs, lost their nerve. And just then, a new sound filled the forest. The sound of dozens of wolves crashing through the undergrowth. It was Marcus, his beta, with reinforcements from the citadel, come to join the fray. The fight was over. Valerius's men surrendered, their treachery exposed in front of Rorik's loyal forces. As the sun began to rise, filtering through the canopy in dusty golden beams, Rorik shifted back to his human form. He walked to Lyra, who was tending to a gash on her leg. He knelt before her, ignoring the mud and blood, and gently took her face in his hands. He saw his mate, his partner, his queen. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion too powerful for words. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and bright, all traces of the haunted exile gone forever. "You saved me first," she whispered. The war was over, and they had won. The throne room was silent, but this time, it was a silence of awe and fear, not of judgment. The captured traitors, including a snarling Lord Valerius who was found trying to escape into the swamp, knelt in chains in the center of the room. The entire court was assembled, their faces a mixture of shame and relief. Rorik stood on the dais, but not alone. Lyra stood beside him, not behind him. She wore her leathers, stained with the mud and blood of their victory, a crown of her own making. He looked out at his people, his pack, his kingdom. The time for whispers and lies was over. "For weeks," he began, his voice echoing in the vast hall, "this court has been poisoned by fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of this woman beside me." He turned his gaze on Lyra, his voice softening, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. You were told she was a liability, a weakness, a disgrace, because of her age and her past. He let his eyes sweep over the crowd, meeting the gaze of every lord, every courtier. You were wrong. He turned back to Lyra, taking her hand in his. Her hand was steady, her grip strong. Her past did not break her. It forged her into a warrior with the skill to save us all. Her wisdom is not a sign of age. It is a weapon that outsmarted our enemies. He raised their joined hands for all to see, his voice rising to a powerful absolute declaration that would be repeated in stories for generations. She is not too old, he boomed, his voice ringing with the power of the Alpha King. She is timeless. She is not my weakness. She is the source of my strength. She is the heart of this kingdom, the soul of this pack, and she is my queen. Then, he looked directly at her, his voice dropping to an intimate, loving growl meant only for her, but heard by all. She is mine. A collective breath was released. Then, one by one, led by his beta Marcus, the lords and ladies of the court knelt, not just to their king, but to their queen. The court accepted Lyra because Rorik's absolute declaration, backed by her own proven courage in battle, left them no other choice. It was finished.
She stood beside him, their hands clasped, and felt the weight of hundreds of kneeling wolves. But it was not a burden. It was a beginning. The words he had spoken, the truth he had declared, washed over her, healing the last, deepest scars on her soul. Timeless. The words settled in her heart, a perfect, shining thing. He saw her, for all that she was, the wild thing, the survivor, the warrior, the queen. She looked at him, her king, her mate, and her love for him was a vast, endless ocean. The whispers were gone, the threats were silenced, and the future was theirs. Come morning. A year later, the sun rose over a peaceful kingdom. The whispers in the citadel had long ago been replaced by laughter and the sounds of a pack thriving. The memory of Valerius and his treachery was a fading ghost story, a lesson taught to young pups about the price of ambition. Lyra stood on the balcony of their chambers, the cool morning air on her face. She was no longer the haunted creature who had sought solace in the gardens. Her hair was long and unbound, and she wore a simple but elegant gown of forest green. She was no longer playing a part. She was simply herself. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, beloved scent filled her senses. Rorik rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth seeping into her. They stood in a comfortable, easy silence, watching the city awaken below. This was her favorite part of the day. This quiet moment, before the duties of being king and queen began. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into her hair. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I was thinking about a stag," she said, "and a very lonely birthday." He turned her in his arms to face him, his golden eyes soft with love. "And now?" "Now," she said, her voice full of a peace she had once thought impossible. "I am thinking that I am home." They had found peace because they had faced their worst fears and their most bitter enemies together, and they had emerged not just victorious, but whole. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of shared mornings and quiet nights, of unwavering trust and a love that had been forged in fire and exile. It was not the desperate kiss of a new bond, but the deep, soulful kiss of a love that was truly, and forever, timeless. In the quiet that followed, she knew her transformation was complete. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a queen, and her story was just beginning. The howl of the Bloodfangs was a promise of death, but in her own woods, and Lyra was the one who made the promises. She gave a sharp, barking command, and they split apart, melting into the trees like ghosts. This was her hunt, her battle, her forest. She was the fury of the storm, the cunning of the wolf, the spirit of the woods. Without warning, the first of the Bloodfangs burst into the clearing. huge, mangy creatures. Their eyes glowing with a mad light, they charged forward, a wave of claws and teeth, expecting to find a small, terrified group cowering in fear. Instead, they found nothing. From her perch on a high ridge, Lyra watched them pour into the narrow gorge below, just as she'd planned. Rorik and his warriors were creating a diversion at the far end, their roars and snarls drawing the bloodfangs deeper, deeper into the trap. "Now," she whispered. With a coordinated heave, they pushed the massive boulders at the edge of the ridge, a scraping of stone and then a deafening groan. The rocks tumbled into the gorge, bringing half the cliffside down with them. The sound was a thunderclap. The ground shook. A wall of rock and earth sealed the gorge, trapping them. Their howls of rage turned into shrieks of terror. The first pincer of the trap had snapped shut. But there was no time for triumph. A new sound, armored wolves crashing through the forest. Valerius's men. She raced through the trees, her paws silent on the damp earth. Rorik's scent pulled her forward. She found him facing down 5 wolves in the council's silver armor. They had him surrounded. He fought like a demon, a whirlwind of black fur and fury, but he was outnumbered. Her heart skipped. As she prepared to launch herself into the fray, her eyes caught a flicker of movement in the trees behind him. A 6th wolf, a traitor from Rorik's own guard. His face a mask of grim determination as he raised a silver dagger for a killing blow. Rorik couldn't see it. Before she could think, her body moved on instinct. She launched herself through the air, a silver-furred missile of pure protective fury. She hit the traitor with the force of a falling tree, her teeth sinking into the shoulder of his weapon arm. The dagger flew from his grasp. He roared in pain, in shock. But it was too late. In the span of a breath, Rorik spun around, his eyes blazing, and finished the fight. He was safe.
He felt the killing blow coming a split second before it landed, a scent of betrayal in the air. He braced for the impact, but it never came. Instead, he heard a familiar, furious snarl and the sickening crunch of teeth on bone. He spun to see Lyra, his fierce, magnificent mate, disabling the traitor who would have ended his life. A love so powerful, so absolute, surged through him it nearly brought him to his knees. She was magnificent. What followed was not a battle. It was a rout. The remaining council loyalists, seeing their ace assassin defeated and hearing the terrified screams from the trapped bloodfangs, lost their nerve. And just then, a new sound filled the forest. Marcus! His beta, with reinforcements from the citadel, come to join the fray. The fight was over. Valerius's men surrendered, their treachery exposed. As the sun began to rise, filtering through the canopy in dusty golden beams, Rorik shifted back to his human form. He walked to Lyra. She was tending to a gash on her leg. He knelt before her, ignoring the mud and blood, and gently took her face in his hands. He saw his mate, his partner, his queen. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion too powerful for words. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and bright. All traces of the haunted exile gone forever. "You saved me first," she whispered. The war was over, and they had won. The throne room was silent, a silence of awe and fear. The captured traitors, including a snarling Lord Valerius, knelt in chains. The entire court was assembled, their faces a mixture of shame and relief. Rorik stood on the dais. Lyra stood beside him. She wore her leathers, stained with the mud and blood of their victory, a crown of her own making. He looked out at his people, his pack, his kingdom. The time for whispers and lies was over. "For weeks," he began, his voice echoing in the vast hall, "this court has been poisoned by fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of this woman beside me." He turned his gaze on Lyra, his voice softening. "You were told she was a liability, a weakness, a disgrace because of her age and her past. He let his gaze sweep over the crowd. You were wrong. He turned back to Lyra, taking her hand. Her past did not break her. It forged her into a warrior with the skill to save us all. Her wisdom is not a sign of age. It is a weapon that outsmarted our enemies. He raised their joined hands for all to see, his voice rising to a powerful, absolute declaration. She is not too old, he boomed. She is timeless. She is not my weakness. She is the source of my strength. She is the heart of this kingdom, the soul of this pack, and she is my queen. Then he looked directly at her, his voice dropping to an intimate, loving growl meant only for her but heard by all. She is mine. A collective breath was released. Then, one by one, they knelt, not just to their king, but to their queen. It was finished.
She stood beside him, their hands clasped, and felt the weight of hundreds of kneeling wolves. But it was not a burden. It was a beginning. The words he had spoken, the truth he had declared, washed over her, healing the last, deepest scars on her soul. Timeless. The words settled in her heart, a perfect, shining thing. He saw her, for all that she was. The wild thing, the survivor, the warrior, the queen. She looked at him, her king, her mate, and her love for him was a vast, endless ocean. The whispers were gone. The threats were silenced. And the future was theirs. Come morning. A year later, the sun rose over a peaceful kingdom. The whispers in the citadel had long ago been replaced by laughter. Lyra stood on the balcony of their chambers, the cool morning air on her face. She was no longer the haunted creature who had sought solace in the gardens. She was herself. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind. Rorik rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth seeping into her. They stood in a comfortable, easy silence. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into her hair. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile. "I was thinking about a stag, and a very lonely birthday." He turned her in his arms to face him, his golden eyes soft with love. "And now," she said, her voice full of a peace she had once thought impossible, "I am thinking that I am home." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of shared mornings and quiet nights, of unwavering trust, and a love that had been forged in fire and exile. It was the deep, soulful kiss of a love that was truly and forever timeless. In the quiet that followed, she knew her transformation was complete. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a queen, and her story was just beginning.